Hello, and welcome to the Mind Your Career webinar series. My name is Brian Wilson, and I coordinate the lifelong learning team here at the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. And I'm very delighted to welcome you to our Journalism and Media and Inside Scoop keynote address. Our speaker today is Tal Kopan. Tal is a political reporter for CNN Politics, where she covers immigration, cybersecurity, and other hot-button issues in Washington. During the 2016 election, Kopan served as a breaking news reporter covering top stories from delegate battles at the political conventions to the Donald Trump presidential transition. Kopan graduated with honors from the University of Chicago with a bachelor's in law, letters, and society. And a fun fact, she played on the Ultimate Frisbee team here, and you can still find her on the fields today. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tal and hand the controls over to her. And just to let you know, she will also leave plenty of time for questions at the end, so we encourage you to write those in at any time. Thanks a lot. Over to you, Tal.
Great, thanks. And yeah, you know, especially since we're doing this digitally, I definitely want to talk about the things that all of you are interested in. So I'm going to start it off and try to hit as much as I think might be interesting, and then we'll go from there. But hopefully this can be a little bit more of a discussion. But I thought I'd start by just sort of giving a slightly longer version, since I'm a keynote and not just a panelist in this one, a slightly longer version of my trajectory thus far. I got hooked on journalism almost by accident in high school. I actually took my first journalism class because I was interested in graphic design, of all things, but turns out I really loved the actual journalism piece of it. You know, taking AP Gov in high school sort of spawned this fascination with political journalism and the role it plays in our democracy. I, went to University of Chicago trying to leave myself room to explore. I really wanted to keep an open mind and not make a career decision, just straight out of high school. And we all went to U Chicago. We know they don't believe in practical majors or vocational training. And so it was really a perfect place to explore. And of course, right away, I joined it was at the time a fledgling features magazine companion to the Maroon. I joined in its first year and became art director, and then took over as editor-in-chief my sophomore year through the end of University of Chicago. And we ended up spinning off, and then the Maroon launched a different features magazine. I'm not sure if it's still around, but that was sort of my on-campus journalism activity in addition to a couple creative writing classes. And then once I realized that, as much as I was trying to explore, journalism was probably it for me, I really realized that meant my summers had to be almost summer school and taking internships. And, I like to dazzle the kids today with the fact that when I got my first journalism Metcalf after my second year, there were only 3 journalism Metcalfs. And this anecdote becomes a lot less stunning the older I get, but still, I'm not that far out of school that there were only 3 journalism Metcalfs that year, all in Chicago. And, so I got the one at Chicago Tonight on WTTW, which is a nightly news magazine program. And it was fantastic. Got some really awesome hands-on opportunities to learn about broadcast journalism and, start to pick up all the stuff you don't pick up in school, like, slang. It's something that they don't talk about, when you're sort of training for a profession, but slang matters so much. When someone tells you to get a SOT, you have to know what a SOT is. And for those who don't do broadcast journalism on a daily basis, that stands for sound on tape. And it's a little soundbite that you play in a show. That kind of stuff is actually really important as you develop your career. So that was sort of my first opportunity to get some of that. The following summer, I just applied to ABC7 Chicago's internship program. I was their first U Chicago student. Again, this wasn't that long ago. And after that, I believe they have a Metcalf now, or they did at least for a little while. Of course, now there are hundreds of journalism Metcalfs, which is just so exciting as an alum to see. And we actually had some U Chicago students as interns on the CNN Politics team last summer. It's just really cool to see that expansion of the program coming out of U Chicago. But so I did the ABC7 internship the following summer. I actually took winter quarter of my 4th year off because I had enough credits, and I decided to get another internship in and do a little bit of work. And so I went back to ABC7, but this time got to intern with a reporter who's now retired, Paul Monkey, but he was just one of the best broadcast writers I've ever seen. And you don't often think about the writing that goes into, you know, a TV package because it's something you hear and see. But in reality, there's some gifted writers and some not so gifted writers when it comes to television. And it was really interesting to intern with him. And actually, it was sort of I'll come back to the other side of this bookend, but I started interning with him just a couple weeks after Rod Blagojevich was indicted. And a lot of that internship was spent going through old file footage of Rod Blagojevich and speeches he gave, including one inaugural address where he talked about promising his father on his deathbed to never take a bribe, which was incredibly ironic in light of the indictment. And so really just a cool opportunity. And backtracking a little bit, so the summer I spent at ABC7, I had mentioned offhand to the reporter I was interning with that I was trying to teach myself a little bit of HTML so that I could build a website for the magazine I ran on campus, because back then it was groundbreaking to think that we needed some sort of web presence. We were already behind, of course, but still for a college, you know, startup publication, it was sort of like, well, I should put something online. And the reporter was like, well, you know, I'm taking some vacation days, so let me talk to our web department and see if they'll let you intern with them when I'm off this summer. That ended up being incredibly fortuitous, and I had a great time working with the web department that summer. And I actually started freelancing with them before I graduated, which I think somewhere it should say I'm AB 09. That was the year the economy crashed. And so my graduating class really sort of entered our fourth year in one world and ended our fourth year in another world. A lot of us felt like we had the rug pulled out from under us. And so just, you know, that spring they had said, come back, you know, and work with us if you get an opportunity. So I said, sure, you know, I'm only taking 2 classes this spring. I can freelance anytime you want. And I didn't really realize at the time that freelancing was like a real job. And so I started being their fill-in freelancer essentially through the summer and into the fall. Anytime when anyone was taking vacation or a holiday or they just needed extra hands, I was freelancing with the web department as a web producer, which in local broadcast, a web producer job is a lot like being the web editor or the entire digital operation of the local television station. So it meant, you know, writing things as needed, putting things up, you know, taking scripts that reporters had written and turning them into actual usable articles, clipping video, deciding what to put on the homepage, deciding how to headline things, pulling stuff from the wire services, all that kind of stuff. And before I knew it, I had 8 months of real, you know, almost full-time experience, and was able to find a job with the local Fox affiliate, partly because I found the job and then realized that one of my bosses at ABC knew one of the directors of the web operations for Fox television stations, all the owned and operated affiliates around the country. And so I just sent him an email like, hey, I applied for this job. It looks pretty cool. I think you know someone there. If you could put in a good word for me. And about 2 hours later, the hiring manager called me. And she later explained to me that when, you know, her boss's boss's boss sends her an email and says, hey, you know, someone I know put in a good word for this applicant, you give that applicant a call. And so I was able to land the job, worked there for about 2.5 years. Again, we were the entire digital presence of that local TV station, and it was a much smaller operation than the ABC affiliate. So some days, especially when my boss was out, I was literally the only person running the website. So it was an incredible experience, but I got a little tired of that type of operation. Some of the time it felt like I was doing reporting in my own newsroom, trying to know what we knew to be able to get it up online. There was no show between, I think, 11 a.m. and 9 p.m. And so it was really hard to convince them at that point, we need to keep the website fresh. We need whatever new information is coming in, we need to get that up. And so, you know, and I wanted to get back to my love of political journalism, although going back to what I mentioned was bookends. You know, obviously doing local news in Chicago and Illinois, you get a heavy dose of politics and it can be quite entertaining. But I applied out to some jobs in DC and got a job at Politico. And actually my last day at Fox Chicago was the day Rod Blagojevich reported to prison. I had covered through the work there 2 of his trials because it was a hung jury the first time. And, the last day we had a helicopter following his car. And I remember he like drove 3 laps around the prison and then went to get like a fast food burger and then drove another lap around the prison and then actually reported. And so, like I said, it was sort of an odd but appropriate bookend to my time in Chicago journalism. But I moved out to DC, started working as a web producer at Politico, which was a little bit less robust than when I'd been at the local TV affiliates. The entire publication was almost all digital. There actually is a paper out in DC, but they're really digital first. And so, it was a lot less needing to do some of the stuff I had to do in local TV and a lot more of just making those judgment calls of like what goes where on the website, what's a good headline, what gets people to read, doing some copy editing. But afforded me the opportunity to write a lot on the side. And that's how I got sort of my break as reporting, was able to prove myself. And within about a year, moved onto the breaking news team at Politico, really cut my teeth working fast and accurately on that team. It was sort of the general assignment team, so to speak. And I was turning out 4 to 8 stories a day, usually only a few hundred words, but still it was, they called it boot camp at Politico. And then I moved into beat reporting from there. They only really want you on the breaking news team about a year because there's a burnout factor. Moved into beat reporting. We were just starting a cybersecurity section. And so I was an inaugural newsletter writer and reporter for that section, covered cybersecurity really in depth for about 15 months, and then needed another change for a variety of reasons. And a former boss of mine at Politico recruited me to join the team at CNN Politics in summer of 2015. I remember, I think it was my second day on the job, in the morning meeting, my boss who ran the team, my former boss at Politico, who now runs the team at CNN Politics, was like, oh, and by the way, Tal, the first Republican debate of the 2016 election is on Thursday, and you're going to be live blogging it. Surprise. And I ended up doing all of our live blogs for the 2016 election with another former editor of mine at Politico. There was a bit of a Politico diaspora to CNN Politics. And, from there, it was just covering the election, which was a memorable experience, exhausting, but front row seat to history and really interesting. And then after the election and things sort of slowed down, I moved into the sort of beat I have now, which is primarily immigration policy, although I tend to cover basically the Homeland Security portfolio because I have the cybersecurity experience and I have some understanding of the law and national security and other issues because of my experience, which allows me to pitch in when there's time to do other things, big focus on election security, for example, that type of thing. And so that's where I am today. If I was just going to draw sort of a couple themes from my career path, which, I often say, and I think I may have put this in the description, but I often say I can sort of draw a straight line backwards through my career, and how even just the offhand decision to say, hey, I'm interested in websites, directly led to things in the future. Unfortunately, you can't draw that straight line going forward. But if I were to just summarize a couple lessons, I would say from that career path, such as it is today, one theme I think that's so tremendously important is networking. And networking can be a bit scary or mysterious to people. I think more so current students than, alums. But I just want to emphasize that when you talk about knowing people, it sort of, I think, comes across as cheating somehow. And that's not really, I think, an appropriate way to think about it. To me, especially once I sat on the other side of the table and saw hiring decisions be made, you don't really fathom when you're applying for jobs that there are 200, 300 people applying for these amazing jobs. And there's only so much you can convey in a resume and cover letter. And obviously in journalism, cover letters are very important because you're usually applying for writing jobs. So you have to show you can do it. But still, I mean, I'm not the world's greatest writer. I'm definitely a functional writer. Some of my reporting skills are other than writing, but still, I can't make a cover letter a must-read piece of work. That's just not how it's going to be. So you have to figure out a way to stand out from the pack. And if you know someone who's willing to put in a good word for you, who's willing to stake their reputation on yours, and I think that's the most important thing. I will not recommend someone for a job unless I believe that person will deliver up to my standards, because I don't want to recommend someone and then have them not turn out great and have the person I recommended them to then question my judgment. So if you have someone who knows you, who's worked with you, who can say to a hiring manager, to a colleague, you know, this person is really worth your time to look at, that is going to instantly set you apart from the pack. And it's going to do so much more than a resume or a writing sample can ever do. And so that's sort of what networking is. It's making a good impression on people. It's reaching out to folks not just when you need something, you know, it's sending them a happy birthday or a how did your kids' first semester of college go? You know, it's those types of things, remembering things about them. And, you know, especially in journalism, that's a lot of reporting as well. You know, you have to really know how to source up in journalism. And that's not only, you know, sort of the parking garage, deep throat kind of source, but just, you know, knowing which experts to turn to on a busy day, being the type of person that they're going to answer your call or return your email, that's sourcing. And so that is sort of the same process as networking for careers. And so it's all about that process, like I said, of setting yourself apart, making yourself memorable. It's standing out, whether you have an internship or a job, and making a good impression on people. And really knowing who you are as a candidate for every job, knowing your strength, knowing your weaknesses, knowing how to play to one, and, you know, build on another. All that type of stuff is important. Turning a little bit away from my career path and sort of generic career advice into specific journalism advice, you know, I often say UChicago teaches you reporting. They just don't make that clear when they, you know, do it. But there are certain things that UChicago teaches you that are absolutely fundamental skills to reporting. So one of the ones is learning how to ask the right questions, not to look for answers. That's really important to reporting. You know, certainly there are times where I'm writing a story and I'm like, I just need one quote that says this. And so to a certain extent, yes, you're looking for a particular thing, but it's knowing how to ask the right question that's going to get you there. That's the real important skill. And then sometimes you don't know what you're looking for. So it's learning how to ask the type of question that is going to result in learning something new. It's also about staying versatile. Sorry, my cat is just off screen. I apologize if I seem distracted. You know, that's a webinar from home. But it's knowing how to stay versatile. I mean, UChicago, the core education, all of us know how to take a subject we may not be interested in, we may have no prior experience in, and at least be able to say something smart about it and learn something at the end of the day. I mean, journalists learn something new every day. It's interrogation of ideas. It's not taking things for granted and, you know, being like, oh, okay, this person said this, I'm just going to assume that that's correct. It's taking those ideas, pitting them against each other, not assuming they're correct, but interrogating them and making sure that they're correct, and constantly questioning that. It's analyzing that information that you've now learned and then synthesizing it and then making a cogent argument about that. You know, it's not a 10-page research paper. Sometimes it's a 200-word story, but it's the same process of taking something you may not know a ton about. Or, you know, maybe you're starting to build a beat and you're getting an upper level of understanding of something, but still, you know, you keep pushing the envelope, keep trying to take those complicated things and make them understandable for people and explain why they're important. All of those skills are basic reporting skills. One of the other things about journalism that I think people don't fully appreciate until they're on my side of the fence is how important some skills that you may never even knew existed are. And one of those is news judgment. I would say the key to being a successful journalist is not a skill like writing, is not a skill like being good on television, although those are incredibly important. And if you're very gifted at them, you can go far. But news judgment is so important. And that's the ability to know what makes a story. I think people often fail to use themselves as a barometer for this. They tend to think, well, it's not relevant what I'm interested in as a story, but that's the exact opposite way to think about it. If you wouldn't read a story you're writing, there's no point in writing it. You absolutely should use yourself first. Would I read this? Would I be interested in this? What about this would be interesting to me? What feature of this story is the one that's going to like pull me in. And just knowing, you know, currently, especially in this administration in Washington, a lot of the news is sort of a level of triage. It's just, there's so many things happening on a daily basis. You know, we go through 3 or 4 news cycles in a day, which is different than a lot of us have ever experienced before. Being able to know that's a story, that's not worth our time today, is such a fundamental skill to journalism. And that's the type of thing you start to learn when you do those internships, entry-level jobs. You got to watch the people around you and those people who've been doing this a long time and ask them, you know, why didn't we cover that? Or why did we cover that particular angle of that story? You know, that's the type of skill that really begins to set a journalist apart. And so sometimes I get asked, especially by people who don't have a lot of experience in journalism and are sort of trying to break in, you know, how do you learn that kind of stuff? One of the things I recommend doing is to use sort of open source material to practice it a little bit, because it is really hard if you don't have an editor reading your work, if you're not sitting in a newsroom with an assignment desk and having someone who can teach you those things. I would recommend taking a live event, so a State of the Union, a televised press conference, a presidential trip where he gives a speech, whatever you can sort of find that is going to be readily accessible that you can watch. And I would recommend sort of shutting yourself off from all the journalism sources out there and taking notes, and then pretend, you know, a lot of journalism is mimicry of, and not in a plagiarism kind of way, but, you know, you mimic the styles of journalism that appeal to you as a way to hone your own skills. You know, if you want to be a New York Times reporter, you want to write like a New York Times reporter. And so I would recommend watching that live event and putting on a hat of, okay, if I were a journalist covering this event, you know, what's the quote that's going to be top of my story? What's the headline? And sit there and actually write, you know, what you think the most important thing that happened out of that event is. And then once you sort of put together what you think was the right way to cover that event, then go out and look at Twitter and look at, you know, various news sources and see what other people responded to, and what did the New York Times headline off of, and what did the Washington Post headline off of, and what did CNN do? You know, that type of work actually does allow you to compare your judgment to others and say, oh, okay, they picked that quote, that's interesting, I wonder why. And, you know, read those stories and start to see, okay, you know, they picked up on this theme, whereas I picked up on this theme, you know, sort of why is that? And so that's one of the only ways I think that if you're not actually in journalism, you can try to practice it and teach yourself. But I think it's a really valuable experience. Again, new judgment is so important. My very first internship, one of the things they had me doing was going through the tape of the press conferences of the day and taking notes. And they would come to me and they say, what was the best quote? You know, what was the key moment of that press conference that we can put on television? I mean, that's one of the building blocks of journalism, is being able to pull that out. The only other thing I'd say, and then I'll open up to your questions, is a lot of people, again, if you're trying to break into journalism, don't really understand how much of a team sport it is, because the most visible aspect of journalism tends to be, you know, people like me who are a reporter, or, you know, who are on television. So you see a byline, or you see a person's face. But there are tons of people in newsrooms who contribute who you don't never ever see. So, you know, web production, where I got my start, is one of those, and it's a really fundamental piece of journalism these days, being able to exercise the judgment of what's our lead story, what's a great headline, you know, understanding basic copy editing, understanding basic HTML and social media. I mean, all those things require journalistic skill, and actually are harder if you need to boil down an entire idea into a headline. That's a lot more difficult than doing it in a 600-word story. Those are important skills. Every TV operation has an assignment desk that is tracking where every single camera is in the field, whether they can send, you know, material back live, everything that's going on for the day that we need to cover, making decisions on the fly if something comes up that we need to change the game plan. Editors who edit the work. I mean, there are just a ton of jobs in newsrooms that are unsung heroes. And so, you know, especially if you're looking to break into the industry, I would urge thinking about all of the different ways that people contribute to just one story you may see at the end of the day. So I think I'll stop there, talk for a while. Hopefully you all have some questions and we can dive further into anything you want to know about.
Great, thank you so much, Tal. This is Brian again, and I'll be sort of asking you the questions as they come in. I want to start with one. We've heard from some other professionals, particularly in print journalism, and they've noted that the sort of path has changed. So for print journalism anyway, in that no longer do you sort of, is the path used to, you'd cut your teeth at these local papers and then move up into these larger national bureaus. But it sounds like from your experience, perhaps that path still remains a bit in broadcast, in that you sort of, I mean, Chicago's granted a large market, but that there's, but you sort of started at a smaller scale and then moved up now into the national, national news scene. Do you see that having shifted with the way these things have gone? Do you see a change in how people break in? Are they going straight to national bureaus now, which is where, most people probably turn to for their news? And just if you can comment on that sort of clear trajectory.
Absolutely. There's definitely a shift in that it's so much easier today to get an entry-level job at a national publication than it used to be. And you're right, I did sort of start in local, but I started in a top 3 television market, which is not something you're supposed to be able to do. I got in because web production was sort of new and they needed people who knew it. And, the folks who started 30 years ago in Peoria maybe weren't so excited about web production. And I was very keenly aware of that when I started. I was 22, 23 years old in a newsroom that I was not supposed to be working in. It was, unless I was about 10 years senior to where I was. So it really forced me to recognize the experience in the room and sort of do a little bit of convincing that I belonged there. But, those paths still exist. And I actually get a little bit frustrated with how many people come right out of college into DC and start doing journalism there. And which isn't to say that they're not good, they are. And, political journalism is a special skill. And if that's really what you want to do, I mean, that's the place to do it. But I sometimes miss local, and I do think that you learn so much from reporting on a community that you are part of and living in, and serving that community in a way that you don't get in sort of the national journalism scene. Politics is not really a community. It's a bit of an insidery situation, which is a little bit different. And I would love to see a lot of, young just out of college journalists continue to go out into the country and, work for local papers and learn those skills from folks who have been doing it several decades. But those jobs just aren't always there anymore, which is really sad to see the crisis we have in local journalism. Everyone has to make their own sort of life decisions. What can you afford? Do you have a significant other? Which was, certainly a factor when I was graduating college in terms of the ability to just pick up and move anywhere. There are all sorts of factors that go into it. So it's absolutely true that the old sort of you have to do this many steps system has kind of blown up, and there are a lot of different entry points, especially if you work really hard and can show off your talent. But that doesn't mean that the old sort of traditional way of going and working in regional papers and that kind of thing is gone. And in fact, I still think that there's a lot of value in it if it's something you're looking to do.
Awesome, thank you. So we have another question from someone who works for a digital first media site, but they're in a business support role. And they note that it sounds like you've worked very hard to bridge these gaps in your career. But the question is, what is something you would want journalists to understand about roles such as analysts, marketers, social media managers, et cetera? And what is something you wish those people would understand, more operationally oriented employees, that is understood about journalists and the type of work you're doing specifically now?
It's a great question. It's sort of an interesting tension in terms of journalism as a business, because journalism doesn't exist if it can't make money. I mean, that's just it's a fact of life. Nothing in this world is free. And if you want to pay successful journalists, there has to be some sort of business model. At the same time, journalism especially, there's this traditional notion of a firewall where you don't want any business decisions influencing your editorial content, or it sort of pollutes the ethics of journalism to have that firewall breakdown. I mean, you should never be afraid to run a story because one of your major sponsors might be involved. That's just fundamentally not okay in the ethics of journalism. So it does create this sort of interesting dynamic where a lot of journalists think, well, I can't think about marketing or business side of things because that's, sort of antithetical to what I do. I need to be sort of pure about that. It's a little bit complicated. I think a lot of journalists, I don't think there are many journalists today who don't think about the future of journalism as an industry. And the people who make journalism successful are incredibly important to that. The ones who do figure out how to sell what you're delivering. The people who can tell you, this is what succeeds on our site, this is what doesn't succeed. And, maybe it's not about the topics, it's about how we package it. It's how we market it on social media. It's how we build the brand that the American public can, respect what you do just because the name CNN is on it. I mean, there's so many different factors that go into it. And so, to the point of sort of understanding each other, I think it's really important that journalists understand that, it's like a tree falling in the woods, right? You can write a really amazing story, but if no one reads it, then, did it ever make a sound? So getting that content out there and figuring out how to get it into communities that really can benefit from understanding it is tremendously important. At the same time, on the business side of things, it is important to keep that separation and understand that fundamentally journalism works when it's pursued for the sake of journalism and not for the sake of clicks and not for the sake of, clickbait and not for the sake of pleasing a sponsor or anything like that. And so towing that line is just, again, when you talk about journalism skills that have nothing to do with writing and you can't learn in a classroom, it's really understanding that sort of tension between needing people to see what you do and also not wanting to have the work be driven by eyeballs alone.
Thank you again. So this is maybe sort of a follow-up to that discussion about, I think, as you mentioned, this idea of business model, and that's something all news outlets have to have because it is a business. But one of the follow-up question, in a way, I think, is in your newsroom, is the team utilizing big data tools?
That's a really interesting question. So obviously there's only so much I could talk about, proprietary information in our newsroom. I think most newsrooms now use some variation of Chartbeat or Omniture or one of these companies that track so much information about what people are reading. And it's pretty incredible the amount of information they can have. They can track how many clicks on a story, which are pretty obvious, how many uniques on a story, but then they can track also how long people read a story, which is an increasingly important metric. It used to be all about clicks, and these days a lot of websites are realizing that that advertisers will pay more if people spend a long time with your content, as opposed to just click through your content and spend 20 seconds there and leave, because that's not going to help them as advertisers get their message through. Video starts, video playthroughs. These services can even do what are called heat maps, where they can show you on your website sort of what people are clicking on simply by placement on a page, in addition to what the headline actually says. I mean, there's a lot of data out there. Some publications do A/B testing of headlines, where they put out different headlines on the same story and see which one's more successful and then analyze it. So I think journalism as a whole is trying to figure out how to use those data flows and what kind of information can be gleaned from them and how it can, sort of inform what we do at the end of the day. Search engine optimization is another huge facet of journalism, understanding that most companies get the majority of their traffic from search engine referrals, from people Googling some sort of event, and just, whatever that first result is on Google is going to get a tremendous amount of traffic. And so, CNN is a little bit unique in that we have a very powerful homepage that a lot of publications don't have, that drives a lot of our traffic to just people coming to CNN.com. That's really not the norm these days for journalism. It's a lot more of people getting it from social media and search engines. And so when I was in local, that was a huge amount of what I did, was try to figure out, how do we make our article really be what people are searching for? And there are all sorts of interesting tricks for that. One tip that I got was people tend to, when they're reading a story, they tend to sort of copy a proper name and then plug that into their search engine. So having those full proper names, exactly as they appear in your sort of search engine fields, like the URL, like the headline, that can be a major driver of traffic that people don't really think about. So there's all sorts of data. And, I think one of the things, outlets are trying to figure out is not just what data they can collect, but how to make that actually useful to what they do on a regular basis.
So following on that a little bit, a question about, President Obama, I think at some point made a statement about how, if he only consumed the news that was in his news feed, he would have a very potentially, a one-sided view, just because they do have these algorithms that direct the types of articles to you that, they think you want to see, essentially. And the question is, particularly with the sort of recent news about Cambridge Analytica and how they use this sort of social profiling in a way to direct certain types of information to people. Do you think that potentially there is some issue with that that way of sourcing news in terms of using using just a search engine essentially to find the type of news, or relying on a news feed from one of those search engines, for instance, that's sort of tailoring what they think you want to see?
This is a really fundamental question to journalism today. And when I say fundamental question to journalism, I think that becomes a fundamental question to democracy. And it's a really important one. And, part of the reason that journalism is having both an explosion of opportunity and outlet and also a crisis of business model is that in the old days, when there were 3 networks and maybe 2 local papers, you could sell eyeballs, and that was it. Everyone had to get your newspaper to get their news and sit there with it and flip through it, and you could completely control what they saw on whatever page, and advertisers paid for that. Same with the nightly news. They had to sit there and watch through the commercials, and that was the entire journalism model. So to a certain extent, there's a bit of a concern of, well, what if we can't control that anymore, both in terms of the advertising dollars, but I think more to your question, in terms of the news producers and the content, producers, how do we get people to read the stuff they should read? And, it's a challenge. I remember when I was in local in 2010, redistricting was happening, and I thought it was the most, important story that could be out there. And so every single Associated Press story about Illinois' redistricting process that I saw across the wires, I put on our website, and I tried to SEO the hell out of it, and I social media'd it, and no one read them. And we saw, the results of one party taking redistricting more seriously than the other in terms of how it shaped state legislatures and Congress throughout the country. And, now Democrats sort of realize their mistake and are trying to get smart on it. And again, that's the type of thing where we don't have control over what people read. But I think to a certain extent, that's a good thing. And I think that it's a bit sort of self-important to think as a journalist, you can tell people what they should or shouldn't read. And, as much as there's a lot of concern about gaming of algorithms, and absolutely people can craft bubbles for themselves and only see news that sort of comports with their worldview. And I think that is a major concern. I don't know that the answer is really in terms of the journalism side of things. You put the good stuff that you can make out there, and if people don't read it, people don't read it. But that doesn't mean that it was bad journalism, and that doesn't mean it wasn't worth your time. And, on the internet, stuff has a life for a long time that, for better or worse, people can find those stories years later and come back to them. And I'm often surprised how much people, I mean, I don't go to homepages anymore. I sit on Twitter, and obviously I go to our homepage, but I sit on Twitter. I get things emailed to me. I like newsletters. I see things on Facebook. I mean, I'm a pretty average news consumer in that sense, and you can get a pretty accurate picture of the world doing that. So I think that the notion that somehow journalists need to craft a feed for people, I think, is an outdated model. I think that journalists should think about producing the best content they can produce. But there are really fundamental questions being asked right now about what the social media companies' responsibilities are, how to promote truth, which I don't know that there's an answer to right now. The next frontier of this is YouTube. A lot of conspiracy theories are spreading through YouTube, and it's partly because someone mentioned to me they had an autistic child, a child on the spectrum, and this child was finding all these crazy conspiracy theories on YouTube without their knowledge, and only when the teachers brought it up to them were they aware of it. And it's partly because people on YouTube seem so authentic. And so there's this question, there's a real problem with media literacy. I think that journalists do have some responsibility in explaining what we do and why our work should be more reliable than the other stuff you can find out there. And that's an argument I will have any day, to explain to people just how journalism works, which I think we take for granted people understand. But something like YouTube, you have a very sincere sounding person telling you something is true. It's very hard to figure out whether or not you should doubt that and find the context for it. And so that's one new frontier of this is that kind of model. It's different than a blog post and stuff you can Google. So there, like I said, I mean, this is a really important issue, and I don't think people have figured out an answer to it yet, but I personally really hesitate to say things. There was this article by a journalist I really respect that went around a few weeks ago about how he decided to take a month or 2 months and only read newspapers. He shut himself off from the internet and only read newspapers. And he was like, my news consumption was so much healthier. And it's like, well, that's great, but no one is going to do that. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. And this is how people get their news today. And so I think any solution that is somehow, well, let's go back to the days of X, just is never going to work. So we really have to deal with the environment we have today and figure out, I think, transparency on the part of news organizations is incredibly important. Putting an emphasis on media literacy, on understanding how to use the internet to search for information and what makes something reliable and what makes something not reliable. These are the types of questions we need to be asking ourselves, I think, most.
Awesome. So in light of current Supreme Court cases and other things, maybe we should have been reading your 2010 work on redistricting. So there's another question I think relates a little bit to this topic, and that's, there's been a lot of discussion about the local journalism sort of bleak future, let's say, as we mentioned a little bit too. Do you think that the local paper sending a reporter to take minutes on a town hall meeting is sort of seriously threatened? And what do you think is needed to maybe keep that service not only viable, but of interest to the public as well?
If I had a really good answer to this question, I'd be making a lot more money than I'm making today. But I mean, look, it's important, and it's not just local journalism, it's foreign bureaus. And, it's paying for journalism that 9 times out of 10 may not produce anything. You talk about going and sitting in a city council meeting and taking minutes. There are so many hearings and city council meetings and all sorts of things happening around the country that are not going to produce news. But every now and then they might. And so it's being able to have a journalism ecosystem where you can support journalists who come back from 9 out of 10 board meetings without a story, but that 10th time the story is so important. And so, it really is a problem. You asked how to get back to having that kind of journalism. It's tough. There has to be the money for it, and there has to be the consumption of it. And, there's a lot of success right now in niche journalism. So tapping into a very motivated, dedicated community that is just going to be addicted to your journalism. So in DC, we see, and when I worked at Politico, I worked for Politico Pro, which is this subscriber-only paywalled system where they have very specific topics. They have an agriculture pro, cybersecurity pro, e-health is one in terms of, you know, the next frontier of health, in addition to another vertical that's health. And these are marketed towards, you may have 1,000 subscribers, but it's an incredibly profitable business model because those 1,000 subscribers are super engaged and influential in that sphere, and they will pay a premium to know everything there is to know about it. And conversely, advertisers who want to reach that specific target audience will also pay a premium to know that you have those 1,000 most important eyeballs. And so there's that now with sort of topic journalism. The question is, it used to be that local journalism had the same business model, right? You had this small town and there was one paper that covered news for that community, and you had a built-in reader base. So the question is, how do you get local communities to crave that kind of journalism about their community again when there's so much nationalization of the issues we all face? And that's a really tough thing. And, you know, there's actually been some sort of disappointing setbacks for local journalism this year. Folks who follow this really closely, there was an organization called DNA Info that was a hyper-local news organization. They had one in New York and Chicago, got shut down because it was basically, you know, a wealthy white male benefactor model, which a lot of journalism is moving towards, and this should be a warning sign. Gothamist and Chicagoist and DCist is the same thing, where you had basically one bankroller who decided they didn't want to do it anymore. You know, there was some unionization issues that sort of precipitated some of those moves. Now you've seen some partnerships try to re-up the Gothamist brand, I think. But it's tough when you have these digital first local news operations that sort of tried to get back to that model of just really intense coverage of a particular community, and to see them have that setback is really frustrating. And I think a lot of journalists are thinking through this and trying to figure out, how do we recapture that? You know, weeklies are another area where you're having a lot of difficulty and tension right now in terms of whether cities can sustain alt weeklies anymore. But at the end of the day, if people aren't going to read it, you can't force them to. And so the real question is, how do you generate a product that is something indispensable to people that they can't live their lives without? And then how do you monetize that? I mean, that's the ultimate question in terms of sustaining journalism.
So again, another sort of follow-up question to this. So regarding premium digital news and paywalls, do you hear anything about an aggregated monthly subscription package similar to what Texture has done, I guess, with magazines?
I don't even know what that is. So, you know, that clearly there's constant experimentation on this front. I think people, you know, as you talk about the explosion of outlets and sources, you know, people are really clamoring for some sort of curated feed. And so there's probably a lot of potential there. Again, I think if I had better answers to some of these questions, I'd be, you know, some sort of successful entrepreneur. I think about them, and, you know, I try to play my part in terms of creating indispensable journalism and, you know, justifying my existence as a journalist. But, you know, I think that for all of these things, experimentation is so important. And, you know, conversely, as a consumer, if you see something you like, supporting it with money is probably one of the strongest things you can do, as a vote of confidence in that experiment that you're seeing happen.
Great. So shifting back a little bit to maybe the sort of career side and industry side of things, one question was, what resources do you recommend to really keep track of upcoming trends in the industry, or how are you thinking about maybe, you know, figuring out, or at least keeping tabs on where the industry is going, since it is such a changing space in many ways?
That's a good question. So there are some outlets that are really specifically focused on the industry of media. Poynter, Poynter, is an outlet that pretty much only covers journalism, and it's really good. The Columbia Journalism Review, which is out of Columbia University, is another publication that really grapples with some of the big issues in journalism and then also covers it, you know, sort of more granularly. Those are two really great resources. And Poynter is also a society for journalists, so they have some resources there. There's also the National Press Foundation here in DC that has a lot of resources for journalists. They do webinars and things like that. They actually also run a fellowship that I did here in DC for sort of young, maybe not in age, but in career DC journalists. I mean, it could be in age, but it's both, you know, introducing you to the industry here in DC and different topic areas. And it's once a month for 9 months. They have these sessions for journalists every year. It's called the Paul Miller Fellowship. So there are resources out there. And then, you know, a lot of publications have media coverage. So the New York Times has a media columnist, Politico has some media columnists and reporters, I should say. You know, the Washington Post has a media reporter and columnist. So there actually is a lot of information out there, and it's kind of hard to say how someone who's not in journalism finds that, because I think in journalism we send a lot of stuff around to each other. But I think if you just sort of opened your eyes to it, you'd be surprised. Vanity Fair, BuzzFeed, all these places do coverage of journalism itself, and they actually do some really great work in terms of trends and both good and bad, layoffs, cuts. You know, when Mashable basically laid off almost its entire editorial department and decided to make a switch to video, I mean, that ricocheted around the journalism industry. We all saw those stories, and it blew up on Twitter and that kind of thing. I mean, when big things like that happen, it really goes around, and then, you know, there are usually think pieces in the next couple of days, sort of digesting what's happened. And, you know, when a new outlet, I mean, look at Axios. So one of the co-founders of Politico and one of their first tremendous reporters, Mike Allen, spun off. There was a bit of a disagreement over the direction of Politico. They spun off and created Axios, and it's already, I mean, in DC, an indispensable publication. And so, you know, there's still experimentation. There's still good stories in addition to some of the bad stories. And, you know, there's a lot of coverage out there, and it's ongoing. People still are digesting whether some things are successes or not in the grand scheme of things.
Thank you. So maybe a little different tact here, but there's a question about what was your favorite assignment to date and why?
That's a really great and difficult question. I mean, there are just so many different ways to take it. I mean, covering the Blagojevich trial was really memorable. I'm a legal nerd. We mentioned at the top, I studied law letters. So, you know, seeing that process unfold before my eyes, and the intersection with politicking, and, you know, now the Supreme Court is sort of grappling with the statutes at play there and what constitutes just politics and what constitutes bribery. And really, Blagojevich himself is almost the only corruption conviction that the Supreme Court is letting stand these days, which is pretty, you know, remarkable. That one was really fascinating on just a number of levels, both in terms of what it meant for the local community and also nationally. You know, covering the 2016 election was also just remarkable, and something I, you know, will probably be telling my grandkids about someday. And being at the conventions, you know, it seems like an ancient memory these days, but going into the Republican convention with Donald Trump, there were all these revolts of delegates who wanted to try to use the arcane rules of the process to somehow deny him the nomination. So I actually was at the conventions a week early, covering rules committee and platform committee as they sort of pulled off all these shenanigans. It was really just fascinating. And, you know, some of these examples I'm giving are incredibly long days. They're exhausting. You're in the trenches, sort of trying to figure out things on the fly in the moment. But that those days can really be some of the most rewarding as a journalist, where, you know, if at the end of the day you're proud of the ability you had to figure out anything new as it was happening, you know, cover it with context and with knowledge and explain why it was important, and then, you know, keep up with the next development coming around the corner, and then, you know, maybe the next day being able to reflect on what happened in a smart way. I mean, that's really the stuff that's exciting. And, you know, that I think that if those aren't the type of days that excite you, certainly sort of news journalism as opposed to more featuresy stuff probably isn't for you, because those days are just tremendously rewarding and fun.
So I think we have time for just one more question. We had a, I think, very serious inquiry from one of the viewers about your cat's name. And what's your cat's name?
Well, I actually have two, but it was Bandit that was coming up right behind my computer. I was trying to hold my computer steady because he was like rubbing his cheek on it. But I have two cats. They're brother and sister. Their names are Bandit and Cleo.
Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I hope everyone watching this found this as enjoyable as I did. And Tal, thank you so much for joining us and giving this keynote for our Journalism and Media and Inside Scoop event. So thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.